one thing I'd like to get into, though, is the reality of this situation, because I think in America, especially among gun rights advocates, it's easy to think of these things only in a theoretical or imaginary way, right? Like, I mean, certainly personally, I absolutely believe that it's much harder to oppress an armed populace than otherwise, and that you often, you see totalitarian dictators disarming their populace, without fail, certainly. And we just laid out there the case for why it's certainly reasonable to think that this could help in the Ukrainian people's struggle against these Russian invaders. But I also want to just talk a little bit more about the realities of this. This is what we're talking about is terrible situation. It's going to be very awful in Ukraine. I think you've mentioned some examples of where this has been successful in the past. Specifically, Afghanistan is now. You've seen two major powers lose wars there, not necessarily because they were outgunned by the local population, but they were outlasted. And you've seen this, countless times in history, including, as I alluded to earlier, the American Revolution. Here in the United States, you had also Vietnam, and there's plenty of examples of inferior military forces winning these sorts of wars if their population is willing to resist with violence for an extended period of time. And perhaps the Ukrainians are, but it's going to be ugly and it's going to be horrific. And, the scenario you just talked about is like the Ukrainian government and military is unlikely to survive the full onslaught of the Russian military just because of the balance in force. And you're going to have to see a protracted fight that's going to likely be very brutal for the Ukrainian people to prevail in this. What are some of the things that perhaps American gun rights enthusiasts aren't used to calculating into these sorts of equations?
I would say the key thing is because as I alluded to in the piece, I think if you were to kind of create a scenario for what the Second Amendment was designed for, this is individuals and literally well-regulated militias fighting for the security of the free state with the right to keep and bear arms. This is, and not to get too into the weeds of geopolitics, but Putin put out an essay last year, and he gave a very angry speech earlier this week, where he effectively basically said the Ukrainian nation doesn't exist. It's not a real country. It's created by the communists. And specifically, he said, if you want decommunization, I will show you decommunization, which is pretty horrific implications. And so, this isn't just a squabble like, say, even when you look at something like World War I, was awful, but Germany wasn't fighting to make it so France did not exist, and France was not fighting to make it so Germany literally did not exist. You have one power coming in who literally is saying, I want to make it so your nation does not exist anymore, and in the fullest way possible, which is something we haven't really seen often. And so the Ukrainians are literally fighting for their nation, not just families, not just homes, which in itself could be enough, but literally for the idea of who they are. And that's something we as Americans have been very fortunate that, even in very serious moments, and I would never, talk down about what we've had to do to fight, in Iraq and Afghanistan. But we were never under threat in terms of our nation will not exist. Terrorism was terrible, but there was no chance that Osama bin Laden was going to make it so America could not exist anymore. And so I think the gravity of this situation is something that I would hope that the pro-gun community would see, because you have noticed a little bit to a degree some on the right who have almost seemed to not embrace Vladimir Putin in Russia, but kind of look somewhat favorably upon what they think he's trying to do when it comes to, say, things like traditional values and things like that. But and again, I don't want to get too into the weeds, but I would say, to borrow a Russian phrase, a lot of that is a Potemkin facade. And if we talk about defending ourselves, we talk about defending ourselves against either a tyrannical government that springs up in our own territory or that comes from the others. The Ukrainians have done this time and time again. Again, in our lifetime, they've done it 3 times. And so it's a kind of thing that I would hope that the pro-gun community in the United States would really look favorably upon and really, root for.
Right. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. My question, though, would be I think there's a practicality question here as well. So Ukraine did this literally as they were being invaded by the Russians. Is it too late? You've seen, I think, Charles Cook at National Review suggested that this is, he's supportive of what's happening, but that it's coming too late in the game. I believe the Interior Minister last year told local media there in Ukraine that there are 1.3 million civilian-owned firearms in the country of about 43 million people. You compare that to the United States, we have over 400 million civilian-owned firearms in a country of about 320, 30 million, whatever the number is now. The point is, Ukrainian adoption of individual gun ownership is far lower than it is, here in the United States. How much of a practical impact can the civilian population have if they're only just getting their, this individual gun right as they're being invaded by, a major world power?
So the one thing I would say is that official Ukrainian statistics sometimes are a little bit off with those, only because as a developing country, they've been working themselves out, but as a result of kind of coming out of being basically part of the Soviet Union, is that up to 1/6 of their economy was black market. So there's a lot more guns than the government officially has. I think actually even in the bill that was passed, they usually have to also pass an explanatory note that kind of says why it's being passed. And they credited that there's probably up to at least 6 million guns in the country. And that was most likely a conservative estimate. There's probably a lot more. So this is, relatively speaking, especially for Europe, a pretty heavily armed population. And again, it's a population that knows. This was more of, again, God willing, in the future it'll be developed. But for now, it was a statement. It was not an accident that one of the last acts Arada passed before the invasion began was to say you have the right to self-defense, the sacred right to self-defense, they called it, because it's not, they know it's not just them they're defending, it's their nation. And so the law itself was more so a defense law. The guns that you could buy the guns that you could buy after the law, you could still, generally speaking, have bought before. It was harder, but you could still kind of get it. And especially over the last couple of months, as fears of invasion expanded, you did see a lot of people running to gun shops. Business, there were 1,000 stories in the Western press talking about how business was booming there. So it was more. Oh, sorry, please.
Well, I was just saying that's an interesting way of looking at all this that I hadn't considered before, frankly. This is more of a sort of a symbolic movement on the part of the Ukrainian parliament to embrace the idea of armed self-defense as they're being invaded by their neighbor. That's how you view really the way this came about.
Yeah. It's definitely not an accident. They, when in the same explanatory note, they didn't say Russia by name because the government was trying not to cause a panic, but they basically said everything but because we're going to be invaded and you have to be able to defend yourself, which is interesting because the one issue, I lived in Russia for a couple of years and I'm in Austria now, and usually we can understand each other, when I'm talking to Europeans and things like that. But the two issues that Europeans, no European I've talked to, almost to a T, has ever been able to understand the American view on is the death penalty and firearms. It's this very different mentality of, usually the conversation goes something like, why are you so paranoid? Why do you think something bad is going to happen to you? Why do you feel the need to carry a gun? And you're a part of the gun rights movement. I'm part of it. We're not paranoid, pulling at, every noise. But it's basically this American idea of, be prepared because something bad is going to happen to somebody. And if it's going to happen to me, I'm going to be ready. Versus this European idea, which is really developed in the post-war era, that, nothing really bad is probably going to happen to me. I'm probably going to be fine. So why do I need to take these extra steps? But in places like Ukraine, in places like the Czech Republic, and in the Baltics, which are also relatively for Europe pretty good on guns, they know bad things can happen because bad things have happened to them a lot over the last 70 years. And so they, as a result, don't really have that, like, I don't think I need to worry about it attitude. They have, to a degree, a similar attitude that Americans have of, something bad might happen, and if it does, I'm ready, and if not, great.